my grandmother, whose name was Edith Swindles, which I always thought was a great name, she was a medium, oh gosh, I guess just before 1900, sort of late Victorian times, and was renowned because she was supposed to be able to generate ectoplasm. And one day she was doing a reading for some housewife in Manchester, and they suddenly said they could see this image floating in the air, and it was a young boy, 5 years old, and he was very, very wet, naked, and his eyes were strange. There was something wrong with his eyes, and then she panicked, and she stopped, and she sort of came out of a trance. And it turned out that she'd had a son called Adrian who died when he was 5 years old and was blind at birth. That was why his eyes were weird. And when he was dying, the doctors had put him in and out of an ice-cold bath to try and revive him. And she stopped doing it after that. It spooked her, surprisingly. When it was actually about her, she couldn't take it. But she was fine with other people's readings. So when I was 10, which would be 1960, on New Year's Eve, she took me to one side at a New Year's Eve party with two of her friends and did a séance with a glass where you put your fingers on it and it starts to move and spells out words. There's a whole alphabet around the table. And in the end, when she was doing that and asking questions, everybody took their fingers off, and in the end she took hers off, and it kept moving and answering questions. And I was watching that. I was 10. I just thought, whoa, that's interesting. And then they told me that I was supposed to do something very important when I grew up, and I should never grow a beard, and it would change certain things in the world for the better.
It's quite a heavy...
It was a very heavy thing to have put on you when you're 10 years old. And I thought the first thing I did when I left home was grow a beard, because it intimidated me that much, even 8 years later, yeah. I'm happy to look at you all. You don't scare me. And what did it do to me when I was a child? Well, look at me now. I guess it just made me aware that there were unseen, unexpected elements to life that people wouldn't necessarily expect. So I started to take into account intuition, and I began to read about Tibetan magic and Western magic and incorporate that into my lifestyle. Well, my father was a drummer in a jazz band in the 1930s and 40s, so by the age of 3, he was sitting me on a drum kit and teaching me how to play the drums. And by the age of 7, I was having piano lessons. And by the age of 11, I was in a cathedral choir. And most weekends, he would take me to see different jazz bands at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. I saw Duke Ellington, Buddy Rich, all those, Count Basie, all those people live. So I grew up completely involved in live music and going to see jazz, and he would play lots of music to me all the time, Frank Sinatra, Thelonious Monk, mainly jazz. Well, what happened was I was living in Manchester in the early 60s, and so it was, 15 miles from Liverpool. So the local rock bands, when I was an adolescent, were people like the Beatles and the Hollies and all those famous beat groups. And in those days, it was a bit like supporting a sports team. You either supported the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. I hated the Beatles. They were a bunch of wussies, in our opinion. We liked rhythm and blues. We liked that garage sound. So I was a Rolling Stones fan from the very beginning. I bought their first single, Come On, the day that it came out. I still have all my singles, every one I bought them the day they were released, right until Brian Jones died. But in 1965, we'd moved from Manchester to Birmingham in the middle of England, and my father worked for a company that cleaned the ABC television studios. And one weekend he said to me, I've got tickets for Thank You Lucky Stars, which was this big weekend television program, one of the only ones in the 60s that was pop music and rock music. And it was from a Birmingham studio, so he took me along, and it was random who you'd see. But that week it happened to be the Rolling Stones doing 19th Nervous Breakdown. I also had Susan Morn, Bobby V doing Rubber Ball, a band called the Measles, who were pretty good. They were all dressed in skin-tight velvet suits and had little spots on their faces so they looked like they had measles. I remember them distinctly. And I had a backstage pass because my father was working there. So I was wandering around backstage looking for either the toilet or some Coca-Cola, I'm not sure. And I literally went bang and bumped into this guy, and it was Mick Jagger. And I said, oh, I'm ever so sorry. And he goes, oh, that's all right, mate. And I said, oh, Mick, could you sign my ticket? So he signed the ticket, and he said, do you want the rest of them to sign as well, get their autographs? I said, yeah. So he took me up to the refectory, and I stayed with them for about half an hour to an hour, just me and the Rolling Stones and Brian Jones, who was my favourite of the Stones. And they were all really very, very nice to me. And I was just riveted by Brian Jones in particular. Of course, I didn't realise at the time they were all completely stoned. So they were all, I was watching them and they would talk to me, they'd go like this. Oh yeah. Everything was in really slow motion. And I was thinking, what's wrong with them? Why are they all going so slow? And it dawned on me not long afterwards when I got stoned. Ah, that's what it was. They were very stoned. And Brian Jones just completely inspired me. Really, it was him that made me decide to truly go into rock and roll from that moment. I just loved his androgynous, otherworldly vibe and the way that he pushed the envelope of what was acceptable in terms of how to look. And I think to this day, I always say to people, if Brian Jones walked into a club now, everyone would turn around and stare and go, who the hell's that? He was a classy guy, classy guy. And really, the Stones, after he was murdered, I lost interest, basically. I think their music somehow decayed into this sort of hard rock pastiche, and it became a money corporation rather than anything else. That's my personal opinion. You could disagree. If you were an American, you probably only heard them after they became a corporation, but for us in England, there was a big shift. I think anyone who listens to Between the Buttons will know there was a big shift. And it was Brian Jones that really did the arrangements and gave the exotic touches to all the songs that made them more unique. And of course, he was the person who really began world music too, with discovering Jujuka in Morocco, who later on became friends of ours too and actually lived in this house for 6 months. So my life has been entwined with Brian Jones ever since in different ways. There's many a story about Brian Jones. In fact, when I did Godstar, the song about Brian Jones being murdered in 1985-86, somebody gave me a jacket. One of their old roadies came to a gig and gave me this jacket that belonged to Brian Jones, and it fits me perfectly. Wow. Interesting, huh? Yeah. And even now, even though I've got it pulled back today, I've got a Brian Jones haircut. Forever and ever, Brian and me. Oh yeah, we met in Nita Pallenberg and Marianne Faithfull. All those people are friends of ours now. So our whole life really has become entwined. I've met all of Brian Jones's illegitimate sons and ex-girlfriends. It's remarkable how it just kept coming back into my life over and over. So I think of him as my guardian angel in rock music.